All right, we'll get started. Greetings, everyone. A very warm welcome to this last webinar of our fall 2023 series. There seems to be a high interest in today's topic based on the number of registrations, so we hope to see a large group present. So the webinar is hosted by the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, which is based at the University of Colorado Boulder. I am Imtiaz Rangwala, the climate science lead at the center, co-hosting this webinar with our social science lead, Heather Yoakum. We bring you these webinars to facilitate a discussion of science, research, and best practices related to adaptation and resource management under a rapidly changing climate, with a focus on the North Central US that encompasses the Missouri and the Upper Colorado River basins. Before I introduce our speakers, a quick word on housekeeping. We are recording this webinar, and you can find all our webinar recordings on our website. During the webinar, all participants will be muted, but you'll have the ability to unmute during the Q&A period at the end. We, however, encourage you to put your questions and comments in the chat box anytime during the webinar, and we will start with those questions first during the Q&A in the order they are received. So we originally had a panel of 3 speakers, but only 2 of them will actually present today in tandem. I, however, will introduce all 3 of them now, as they all contributed to the material. First is Stephen Handler. Stephen works for the USDA Forest Service Northern Research Station and is the acting deputy director of the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. He works across the upper Midwest, building partnerships, assessing climate change risk, and working with forest managers and landowners to develop real-world adaptation projects. Stephen has a master's in resource conservation from the University of Montana. Next is Dr. Benjamin Zuckerberg, who is a professor in the Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His research focuses on how modern climate change and habitat loss influence wildlife behavior, abundance, and distribution. Members of his lab often work closely with natural resource managers to provide guidance on various aspects of climate change adaptation. Ben received his master's from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and a PhD from the State University of New York. And finally, we have JC Bernard Placid, who can't be in person today, but contributed. JC is a PhD candidate in the Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. JC grew up in rural Michigan and went to the University of Manitoba for his master's in natural resources management. After that, he worked as an avian ecologist with Bird Conservancy of the Rockies before starting his PhD. JC's research has focused on avian demography and life history, the ecology and conservation of grasslands and grasslands birds, and related topics in applied management. His PhD work most recently has focused on the importance of microclimate variation in temperate grasslands. The title for today's webinar is The Art and Science of Developing a Menu of Climate Change Adaptation Actions for managing wildlife and ecosystems. So thanking all our speakers and contributors, I will now ask Stephen to please take it away.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for the kind introduction. I'm going to present the first third or so of the webinar today before passing the torch to Ben. Before I dive in completely to the material, I do want to also recognize a couple of our close collaborators on this project who weren't able to join us in the presentation today, namely Chris Swanston from the U.S. Forest Service, Chris Hoving from the Michigan Department of Natural Resources, and Olivia Ledee from the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. So it definitely was a team effort. And Ben and I will try to do it justice today. So just by way of prolonging this introduction as long as possible, there are two organizations I want to tell you about briefly. The first being the USDA Northern Forests Climate Hub, which is one of a network of USDA climate hubs. These are designed to be conduits for all of the USDA family of federal agencies to work more collaboratively to deliver tools and information to farmers, ranchers, and forest land managers. And I am part of the Northern Forest Climate Hub, which spans 20 states from Minnesota to Maine, Missouri to Maryland, and also supports two other regionally focused climate hubs in the Midwest and Northeast. And I'm also right now acting deputy director of an organization called NIACS, the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, which is a partnership, kind of a hybrid of federal and non-federal organizations. You see the logos on the screen there. NIACS is responsible for technical assistance and science synthesis around the topics of climate change and ecosystem carbon management. And we include a diverse range of organizations, including forest sector organizations, a tribal commission, a national conservation organization, and 4 universities throughout the Midwest and Northeast. Okay, so I think I am in a relatively safe space here. You all signed up to come to this webinar, and so I think it's appropriate and a comfortable place for me to acknowledge some barriers that all of us who care about this issue and work on this issue of climate change and climate change adaptation probably face day in and day out. Maybe we don't always express them this clearly. And so I'll just tick through a couple of them, and we can all just kind of let out our sigh of despair and get that out of the way, and then focus on problem solving. So the first barrier that I want to be clear about is that we know a lot of climate change science that is being produced isn't being used. There's this mismatch in the scale at which science is produced and the needs of land managers and ecosystem managers, and that is a real barrier. Talking with land managers who are already strapped and overwhelmed, and then introduce all the complexities and challenges that climate change brings to their jobs, and you very quickly pick up this very clear signal of being overwhelmed. There's a huge volume of climate change information that's being produced. It's hard to stay abreast of everything that is being published. It's easy to feel isolated and that, hey, I'm trying to adapt, but I don't know where help exists, and I don't know how to communicate my successes and failures. Sometimes you're working in an agency, frankly, that is not always a comfortable place to air your concerns and challenges when it comes to incorporating climate change into your work. And finally, it's an early enough field, we're all early enough in this challenge, that there really isn't one consistent model of success when it comes to climate change adaptation. We're still developing the best practices. We're still testing strategies, and so we know it's hard to give kind of cookbook guidance to managers on how they should best adapt the ecosystems and species that they may be managing. So these are persistent, they're real barriers, and it's important just to acknowledge them. And I had this all worked out with Ben. He was going to play some inspirational trumpets right now. Go, Ben. Ba, 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 ba. Oh, okay. And so here we come to solve these barriers for you. One tool that we're going to talk about today is kind of a thought process to help managers break climate change down into less of a daunting problem and more of a logical sequence of steps and questions that they feel comfort and autonomy in answering. And this is a process that NIACS has developed and tested over many years working with primarily a forest management community. It's called the Adaptation Workbook. I'll give you a quick tour here in a moment, but at a high level, it is designed not to be a recommendations process for like delivering recommendations. Instead, it is a process to help a manager create their own clear rationale and plan for climate change adaptation by connecting their management goals and their knowledge and experience in a particular place, in a particular context, to climate adaptation actions that they can implement on the ground. There's paper copies as well as an online version of this. We've workshopped several different formats of this adaptation workbook over the years. And no grand reveal here. It's not rocket science, so to speak. It's probably a flow chart that is similar to other adaptive management charts that you're used to looking at. And so these are the 5 steps of our adaptation workbook process. Again, it's trying to provide a little structure, but also a lot of flexibility. The process starts with asking a manager to clearly articulate their management goals and objectives. Then taking a step to assess climate change impacts and vulnerabilities, drawing in information from published climate change vulnerability assessments and scientific literature, traditional ecological knowledge, management expertise and familiarity with the system, and doing the necessary mental downscaling to try to translate regional expectations and regional climate impacts. Think about how they may play out at the scale of the problem that you are focusing on. The third step of our adaptation workbook is critical thinking, or kind of a gut check moment to pause and reflect and consider the management goals and objectives that you started with at the beginning of the process to decide whether they are more or less feasible given the climate change impacts and vulnerabilities that you have uncovered. And then this is where you, as a manager, provide your rationale for either carrying forward with your business as usual management goals and objectives, or revising or getting rid of some of the goals and objectives that you started with if they no longer seem feasible. This is your opportunity to write your climate-informed management objectives for yourself and to defend your rationale for doing that. After all of that preamble, then we get to the fun part, step 4 of brainstorming, being creative, problem solving, and identifying adaptation approaches and tactics. And then finally closing the loop with a monitoring step to decide, as your project plays out over time, how will you know if your adaptation actions are in fact effective? And what information would you need to gather along the way in order to make that decision about effectiveness? So that's the adaptation workbook process in a nutshell. And as a supplement to this process, in our brainstorming step, we provide a companion set of resources that we call menus of adaptation strategies and approaches to sort of help provide, again, some structure to this brainstorming and to give managers a place to begin as they are being creative and problem solving the ways they may like to adapt. In general, the adaptation workbook is set up for having a transparent record of how you have incorporated climate change considerations into your work. And this is particularly useful for some of our core audiences like national forests that need to provide a rationale and to be able to answer public comments and withstand some scrutiny about, yes, in fact, here's how we did consider climate change as we designed this project, and here's why what we came up with is defensible. This process also helps make sure that climate adaptation decision-making is intentional by clearly connecting adaptation actions to the goals and objectives that you started with, and also the climate impacts that float to the top as the highest priority for the system or the species that you are focusing on. We really want to avoid kind of shooting from the hip when it comes to climate adaptation and just kind of winging it based on what sounds interesting or what you have heard your neighbors or partners are doing. Part of our professional standard now, as land managers, as natural resource professionals, is to be able to demonstrate how we're putting our expertise and our professional judgment into these decisions related to climate change adaptation. And so that demands this level of rigor that you can clearly say, I'm managing for outcomes A and B. Climate change is going to present these effects and challenge my management in these ways, and therefore I'm going to do X, Y, and Z to adapt. Right? And this adaptation workbook sets up that clear rationale or chain of thought to do that. And ultimately, this adaptation workbook is all about flexibility. There is no pressure to end up at one adaptation outcome over another. We're not advocating that everyone jumps headfirst into ecosystem transition. We're also not advocating that everyone takes a really defensive resistance mindset to adaptation. And so really all places along that spectrum are viable outcomes. Again, our purpose is to help people break this problem down into steps and to be able to clearly demonstrate their rationale and their thought process. In case you're interested to see how this process has actually played out in the real world, we are creating a library growing all the time of real-world adaptation demonstrations. Every dot on the map here represents a real-world instance where a manager went through the adaptation workbook process and came up with their own customized adaptation plan. So that's the unifying thing here amid a huge variety of agency types and focal ecosystems and scale and complexity of project. And so this project list is searchable, and so you can find some projects that seem interesting to you and relevant to the work that you're doing. So I mentioned a little tangent a couple slides ago, this idea of an adaptation menu as a supplement to the adaptation workbook process. I'm going to go a little deeper here and then tee up Ben to talk about the wildlife adaptation menu in particular. And so when I talk about an adaptation menu, this is a product that NIAX has conceived and then worked with a whole variety of partners to develop more and more of these menus. And basically, I'm talking about a organized, comprehensive list of adaptation actions within a particular discipline or within a particular topic area. And it is organized in such a way to go from general to specific ideas with some signposts to represent major ideas that help land managers kind of quickly scan and get a sense of, here's the breadth of adaptation choices that I have available to me, and then I can go general to specific and get into the weeds from general category to more specific idea and find ideas that are suitable for my place in my project. And we have found that this menu structure for presenting adaptation ideas has been effective because it helps you consistently present adaptation ideas in a consistent level of specificity, and to have kind of a familiar hierarchy from general to specific. And so we design our menus around categories that we call strategies and approaches, which are intentionally designed to help fill this gap between high-level adaptation concepts or options and the actual on-the-ground tactics that need to be implemented. So the strategies and approaches are kind of intermediate levels of specificity that can take someone from a general idea like, I want to explore ecosystem transition. Well, that's great, but it doesn't get you all the way down to a tactic that you can implement. The strategies and approaches are written at that kind of increasingly more specific level in order to help you make those leaps. In so doing, these menus also provide some breadcrumbs to help you document the intent of an adaptation action, because when you ultimately write an adaptation tactic that works for you and your place, it is connected to an approach and a more general strategy, and it sits within kind of a higher level adaptation concept. So you can tell that full, explain that full rationale from this specific thing I want to do, and here's why I want to do it. And then lastly, we think these adaptation menus are helpful because they present, again, a broad continuum of ideas, including ideas that can be mutually opposing. And so it really forces managers to consider, okay, this is the full range of choices I have available to me under this large umbrella of adaptation action. As our NIAX team has developed more adaptation menus since our very first forest management and silviculture menu back in 2012, we followed more or less repeated pathway to developing each menu. Each menu generally includes a literature review and synthesis of available information within a topic area. There's a lot of sausage making that goes into binning and presenting the ideas in that tiered hierarchy that I mentioned. We do a lot of testing with managers in workshop settings or one-on-one consultations with managers to expose flaws and unclear wording, things like that. And then we go through a formal publication process for every menu that involves peer review. And as we sit right now, we have 13 published adaptation menus in a range of disciplines, from forestry to outdoor recreation to coastal ecosystems and tribal considerations. So now that you have the background of our adaptation workbook and menus, I'm going to turn it over to Ben. Thanks, Ben.
Great. Thanks, Stephen. And yeah, everyone, I'm going to kind of go through a little bit how the sausage is made, in terms of our own application of this general process to sort of wildlife management and thinking about wildlife adaptation actions. And so maybe before I begin, I'm going to take you through this imaginary sort of analogy here. Ultimately, let's say you have a problem. You kind of walk into a hardware store and you see lots of tools. There's a lot of tools that you can choose from, but as you kind of walk through the store, maybe some of them are mislabeled, some of them are in weird sections. Maybe you kind of go and you ask for help and they take you to, a certain area of the store and you see like there's row after row after row of just hammers, and that's all they have available to you in order to actually, solve that problem. And in many ways, this is how I think our group kind of envisioned or saw the nature or the universe of wildlife adaptation actions. Like what's available to them out there is a sea of adaptation actions, and how can we help managers choose from this sort of large menu, this large sort of hardware store full of different tools that they can use. So really our goal here, our project goals, was to basically synthesize the peer-reviewed recommendations for wildlife management under climate change, really kind of focusing on climate change adaptation. Think about how we can organize these actions for wildlife at a scale and resolution that can inform sort of on-the-ground management. And then ultimately, can we demonstrate, can we actually show how this resource can help wildlife managers? So next slide, Stephen. So really one of the first things I would say, and again, in my own experience working with Stephen and our group here a little bit, when we talk about these management sort of action menus, one of the first things really to do is who's your target audience? And for us, it really was thinking about terrestrial wildlife managers. And right away, we kind of made this decision that ultimately we wanted this menu to kind of reflect, at least for us, kind of these two ways or approaches that most wildlife managers think about implementing action. One of them is sort of managing populations, and the other is managing habitat. And so that was clearly from the onset, sort of those two components of the menu that we wanted to focus on. I'll just sort of note real quickly that We didn't really kind of tackle fisheries or fishery science or management primarily because that's its own menu entirely. So we really were kind of focused on terrestrial wildlife. Next slide, Stephen. So, okay, as Stephen mentioned, like kind of what do you initially do? How do you build these menus? So the first thing we did was did a systematic literature review. And this was looking at aspects of climate change and global warming, definitely looking at studies that had some component of wildlife or biodiversity. And when you kind of do this initial database review, we got back roughly about 2,100 scientific studies. We went through another sort of filter there and we excluded non-wildlife articles. And so now we have about 1,300 studies to work from. So from there, we actually wanted to focus only on studies that have management recommendations. Again, this is focusing on climate change adaptation. We wanted to look at impact. We wanted to look at studies that had some sort of application or recommendation. And so in that case, we kind of found about 500 articles or so. And of those, we basically were able to tease out about 2,300 different recommendations. Okay, so that's a lot. Next slide, Stephen. So of those recommendations, then we wanted to see, remember back in our hardware store there a little bit, which ones were kind of the most, obvious, the most widely used, the most widely cited. What are those hammers that they're trying to use for everything? And so really right off the bat, what we found was that things like establishing, enhance, and protected areas, maintain or create optimal cover. Those were some of the most widely cited, widely offered recommendations in the literature in the database. Probably what was less sort of common, but still there, things like preventing or controlling wildlife disease, plan for and reduce human-wildlife conflict, maintain or enhance survival. And so we kind of had this study that Olivia led the charge on, basically using a textual analysis to identify these different recommendations in the database. And this was kind of the starting point. This was the inception. We had now all these different recommendations. This is the beginning of the menu. Let's go see whether or not it matches reality. And so we started piloting this in workshops. And so we had 3 different workshops, Michigan, Wisconsin, Nebraska, over a couple of years. And we kind of brought the menu, these sort of list of strategies. We kind of made them, continue to make them more detailed. And I would say really this is one of the most essential parts of building these menus, because the systematic literature review definitely gives you a sense of where to begin. And ultimately, you can definitely inform managers that are working on the ground about these strategies, but it's bidirectional. So they come in with their own experiences and they tell you and help you modify, okay, yeah, this makes sense, but ultimately maybe we can change that strategy a little bit. Sometimes you're missing entire strategies. Like we use these kind of actions and approaches, where are these? We don't see these. And I think a good example of that in terms of these different workshops, like despite the fact that we went through this really rigorous literature review and everything like that, they definitely came to us and were like, well, I think you're really kind of missing migratory species. I think in many cases, no action is an action. And oftentimes we have to do that kind of work. Sometimes it can be to one that was really oftentimes missing was human-based interactions, human-based recommendations and strategies. And that's something that we oftentimes do. We don't see reflected here. And so that's definitely part of the process here, is kind of doing these workshops and building this menu. Next slide, Steve. Okay, so moving forward then, what we found with our wildlife adaptation menu, we kind of had our general strategies. As kind of Stephen mentioned, these are kind of the upper level, 30,000-foot view. What are the big strategies? And so we kind of broke this down into 3 different ways. Like one of them is this first one was populations. And so in this case, we had about 1 through 7 of these that were sort of the broader strategies. We had strong consensus. These are things that people generally think about climate change adaptation as being important strategies for wildlife management: maintain and enhance genetic diversity, establish and maintain connectivity, facilitate range shifts, manage interspecific and biotic interactions, sustainable population sizes, adjust harvest regulations to manipulate populations, and plan for and reduce human disturbance and human-wildlife conflict. The other group was habitat. And in that case, and I think all of us can imagine, it had some sort of thing, something to do with manipulating, let's say, food, water, and cover as a form of adaptation. Maybe you're trying to align that food, water, and cover to sort of future conditions. Maybe in some cases, you're trying to either establish or maybe enhance protected areas, or you're trying to think about promoting wildlife conservation outside of protected areas. And then this is definitely where we got input from, those managers where this sort of extra set, intentionally choose to take no action. It's definitely something that people sometimes have to feel like if their conditions are going to be so novel in the future that ultimately, they're just going to have to monitor and see how this plays out. Or they're engaging human communities in wildlife conservation. That's another thing that our participants pointed out. So as Stephen mentioned, I think the strategies are great. Like they definitely kind of set the framework. And that's oftentimes, honestly, when we go through the literature review, about the level that we find in most recommendations. These sort of broader strategies, but really the criticism, as I think all of you can imagine, is like, how do we take this broad strategy? Let's say this one from a population level, facilitate shifts in the geographic range of the species in anticipation of future conditions. Yeah, that's a really great strategy, really important. How can we do this? Like, what is the actionable step that we can take to actually implement this, right? And so what we found was that the next step in all of this was really drilling down in that hierarchy. What are certain approaches? So for example, under that broader strategy, establish corridors, minimize barriers to movement to new suitable habitats. Going one level down, what does that mean? What are some of the tactics that people use to do this? So we collected that information, create highway crossing structures that span barriers to northward movement, connect mature northern or boreal forest habitats oriented as, let's say, north-south, so that allows sort of facilitates and northward migration. Maybe, again, sort of an approach to prepare suitable habitat in anticipation of future introduction. Maybe in this case, we're talking about providing technical assistance to enable private landowners to, let's say, create grassland habitat for quail or other grassland birds. So you can start seeing here that really what we are doing is beginning to sort of drill down in that hierarchy. Oftentimes managers are bringing those tactics to us and we're trying to fit them within that broader hierarchy. So as an example, next slide, Stephen. Of habitat, maybe again, we're restoring and maintaining sources of food, water, and cover as components of the habitat. Again, important, really important climate change adaptation strategy. What are we talking about? How do we actually do that? So maybe we're talking about managing, creating suitable microhabitats and microclimates. Maybe we're talking about as a tactic, where are those vernal pools? How do we create them potentially? How do we maintain them? How do we protect them? Maybe we're saying about implementing forest management actions that promote diverse canopy cover, light environments, down woody habitat. Again, these are not necessarily things that we are ultimately, reinventing, but these are basically taking these actions and putting them within the broader context of climate change adaptation. And it helps those managers think about what those tactics could be like and what, again, down the road, what strategy are they trying to hit when they actually implement those actions. So it's definitely out there now. We've kind of published this climate change adaptation actions for terrestrial wildlife management. I certainly encourage you to go out and check it out. And I think a really nice example of this moving forward is kind of showing a case study of what happens or how potentially a group of managers can actually use this menu. And for that, I'll kick it back to Stephen.
Okay, thanks, Ben. So just to provide another illustration of how the Adaptation Workbook and adaptation menus work together to support managers to build their own customized climate adaptation plans, I decided to pick one example from one of our pilot workshops as we were developing the wildlife adaptation menu. This was a workshop we held in Nebraska. And so we had one project team at that workshop. Came with this project, and I'll give you a brief tour now. They were looking at wildlife habitat and sustainable agriculture on a 20-kilometer section of the Central Platte River in Nebraska. And so the first part of our adaptation workbook process is asking them to clearly articulate their general management goals and then specific management objectives for the project. And you can see those here. They had some targets they wanted to hit in terms of cover of different cover types within the river corridor and kind of surrounding agricultural fields. Then we went through a process of allowing the team members to review regional climate change information and climate trends, and to, again, contribute their own local knowledge and expertise to identify which of these are going to be most meaningful to our project, and how will these general climate trends play out specifically here. And to do that kind of mental downscaling. And so again, you see some of the specific impacts that they were really focused on. And again, harkening back to the intentionality piece, then we come back to these when it comes to adaptation, where we're asking them to solve or address these particular impacts and to keep these front and center as they're developing their adaptation plans. Just to show you a nice image they had about that braided character of the river channel changing through time, which is, a habitat feature that sandtail cranes and other migratory waterfowl really depend on. I thought this was a nice example that they were able to provide. Jumping ahead in our process to step 4 and showing kind of a breakdown of how one adaptation plan and one adaptation project can contain a diversity of adaptation ideas that span a spectrum of resistance, resilience, and transition sorts of adaptation actions. And again, this gets to the flexibility piece. We're not asking anyone to really steer towards one predefined outcome. And then the team generated many adaptation tactics during the course of this workshop. I'm just picking a few of them here to highlight the action that they were able to make and the way they used the wildlife adaptation menu as kind of a springboard to get there. So, for example, focusing on one of those human-centered and kind of private lands adaptation strategies, manage public or private agricultural land to provide compatible wildlife use. And then the tactics were having to do with no-till agriculture, cover crops, and precision ag in particular, to really reach that farming community neighbors of this wildlife corridor. One of our habitat-focused actions, 8.8, maintain or mimic natural disturbance regimes to enhance habitat quality. And so they talked about a mix of things that are maybe more feasible now with changing climate conditions, doing a little more grazing in the winter and prescribed fire in the summer as opposed to spring to have an even greater effect on the vegetation communities they were managing. And then showing you at least one transition focused tactic that they developed as well, and that is encouraging a shift from conventional row crops to native meadow species or alternative crops, specifically thinking about providing food sources over a longer duration of time, given that migration dates are changing for sandtail cranes and other species. And then the monitoring piece of our process. How would you demonstrate whether those adaptation actions are indeed being effective? Well, these are the kinds of things that they will have to work with partners to track throughout the course of this project. Okay, so just a quick tour of the thought process and the menu. I'm turning it back to you now, Ben.
Great. And I just wanted to kind of take this opportunity to kind of tell you about what is a new and emerging menu. And this one is really going to be focused on grasslands. And I think I don't have to tell this audience, but, why are grasslands important? Well, clearly they're a pretty dominant ecosystem, throughout the country. About 25% of the United States is grassland and or pasture. Most grasslands clearly occur sort of in the north central areas and the Great Plains, but areas of natural and planted grasslands really are found really throughout much of the country. And so it clearly is a very widespread and extensive ecosystem. So why they're important? Again, I think it goes without saying, but they do play these very important ecosystem services. They control erosion, surface runoff, pollination, important aspects of ranching livelihoods, and certainly for carbon sequestration. They also clearly served as critical habitat for many obligate and declining grassland species. So, for example, for grassland birds, we're talking about the fastest declining group of species throughout North America for the last 30 to 40 years. They are also heavily managed systems. So we do prescribed burning, we do mowing, we do herbicidal treatments. So absolutely, grassland systems are heavily managed as an ecosystem. They are also imperiled in the sense that we've lost over 60% of native grasslands. For tall grass prairies, it's more like 90%. And they also tend to be highly exposed to climate change. So when we've done all the analyses to look at sort of where the rates of climate change are happening the fastest, we call this kind of climate change velocity. That velocity tends to be fastest in these low-lying grassland ecosystems compared to things, let's say, with more topographic complexity. So definitely they occur at these low elevations. They lack that buffering canopy structure, and as a consequence, they are really exposed to climate change compared to other ecosystems. And yet, when we talk about climate change adaptation and the strategies associated with climate change adaptation, when we looked at sort of that review that we did of these 2,000 or so different recommendations, actually fewer than 100 of them were specific to grasslands. So we actually see this as an important sort of need in the community in terms of conservation of grasslands to think about what is climate change adaptation, what are some of the things and the strategies that would be important for managing these systems. So we are kind of right in the fires of it right now in terms of developing this menu. We've done a literature review. We've got about 4,000 different studies that we're beginning to do this process, extracting these strategies. We're crafting that menu right now from the literature. We've done aspects of soliciting expert opinion, and we've already done some preliminary workshop testing, and probably will do a little bit more in the coming year. So I'm just going to give you a quick preview a little bit of kind of what we have found as being the 8 sort of essential strategies for grassland adaptation. Number 1, sustain ecosystem functioning. Number 2, reduce stress or impact. Number 3, enhance genetic diversity. Number 4, maintain and restore extent. Number 5, landscape scale resilience. Number 6, adjust site level management. Number 7, facilitate ecological transition. And finally, engage communities. And as you can tell, again, as the menu develops, as this process plays out, these are what we would consider to be these sort of broader level strategies. But just to kind of give you a taste of what we're drilling down into those approaches and those tactics for, let's say, sustained ecosystem functioning, we may be talking about maintaining structure, being able to manage the heterogeneity and disturbance as essential to grassland health. What are the appropriate fire, grazing, and mowing that may help sustain resilience and prevent entire sort of state level shifts? For reduced stressor impact, maybe we're talking about restoring embedded wetlands. So in this case, restoring natural wetlands and grasslands can help increase moisture in the system and improve drought resilience. Maybe for enhancing genetic diversity, we're talking about many grassland species have functional traits that vary across climate gradients in their ranges. How can we actually seek to preserve that, to utilize that genetic diversity, especially when we're talking about like seeding projects? And last, we'll kind of give you another hint of this with restoring habitats in favorable climates. The idea here is maybe creating habitat in areas where climate may in fact projected to remain suitable, sort of is a no regrets conservation strategy. That may certainly help species persist in these areas where potentially exposure is going to be a little bit less or at least moderate. And in those areas, we really want to kind of focus on restoring habitats within those environments.
Ben, quick time check.
Yep, we're wrapping up. So I just want to say, look out for our grassland menu in 2024. We're very excited about this, and we're absolutely happy to take any questions that you might have. So thanks for joining us today.
Fantastic. I didn't have to butt in there. I think I'll stop sharing the screen, and so folks can join in. I'll also give everybody an option to where they can now unmute themselves and show their video if they want. So you should be able to do that, unmute and share your video as we get into this discussion session, Q&A session. Thanks again, Stephen and Ben. That's great. So we have a few questions that were submitted on the chat. We'll start with those, and then then people can just do a popcorn style Q&A until we reach the end of the hour. And then, as I've said in the, I just wrote in the text in the chat that we plan to have an informal session after that for 15-20 minutes. And if you just want to participate in that, please feel free to join. That piece won't be recorded, so very informal. Okay, so let's start with first question we got from Stefan Tengen, and it was just asking about examples of success with managers in working with the workbook. Asking if any particular sectors or levels of government has been most successful and why.
Well, I'll start, and my answer is kind of influenced by our organizational bias at NIAX. So we started with the adaptation workbook and an adaptation menu that was exclusively focused on forest management and silviculture. And that was the extent of our toolkit for 5 or 6 years. And then we entered this era of kind of menu proliferation and branching out into kind of the wider world of natural resource management. So over the full decade that I've been working on this, I've seen the most consistent engagement from national forests, because our agency has an expectation and a planning rule that says, we are expected to account for the effects of climate change in our projects, and there's a public comment period, public comment opportunity. And this is something that the public is increasingly asking for. And so national forest project planning teams have been taking us up on our offer to provide this kind of support, to lead their teams through this process of going through the adaptation workbook and using these adaptation menus for several years now. So it has definitely helped to have public scrutiny pulling them along, also to have this organizational expectation. But then also we've seen a lot of engagement from tribal nations in the Midwest and Northeast. I think tribes have consistently been the loudest voices, kind of calling for action and recognition of the effects of climate change on tribal values and treaty rights. And so we've also had a really long and healthy run of engagement with tribes using the workbook. Ben?
Yeah, I'll weigh in. Maybe it was just a story in the sense that I've seen it now being used quite a bit by state agencies as well. Rush Creek State Natural Area here in Wisconsin, really used the basically brought together a small group of partners, NGOs, Wisconsin DNR, so forth and so on, and really used the book to kind of be able to sort of craft a way forward for how to manage that area and identify what strategies and tactics that they were really most focused on. And so much so that they were actually very successful in getting additional funds to actually implement those strategies. Like they had a plan set out. And I think Stephen mentioned this before, that the menu serves as this sort of springboard for a lot of different efforts and agencies. And I think that really is the power for it. It brings people together, allows people to kind of think about taking what is this potentially very large amorphous problem of climate change and think about what are the necessary steps in order to enact change on the ground.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'll go to the question by Mandy Slate, and I'll combine both her questions. Basically, she's asking, can you clarify how managers engage with menus? I think you've already offered some clarification, but if there's more to it, go ahead. And when testing with managers, do you try to get managers that are at a more administrative level or managers implementing tactics?
The menus are not chained to the workbook. We do have some interesting examples of how managers have picked up the menus as kind of a separate resource and used them in ways that we didn't expect. For example, we have examples of states using our adaptation menus in large planning documents like state forest action plans and state wildlife action plans, and kind of using them as a way to organize, well, here's what we're doing. And so kind of like, it's an interesting way to present a range of adaptation ideas. We've had forest industry organizations that are responsible for writing climate adaptation plans use the menus in a similar way as just kind of a convenient rubric, so to speak. And then, yeah, once we've also had some frequent flyers, so to speak, organizations and project teams that have gone through the workbook process a couple of times, and they kind of understand the process and have internalized it, and then they're very comfortable just kind of flying on their own and using the menu to pick and choose applicable adaptation actions for future projects.
Thanks.
Oh, and then your second question, we try to get both. We definitely at our workshops where we're vetting these adaptation menus, we definitely get field managers, folks who would be responsible for writing a site level management plan and implementing that work. We want to make sure these ideas are clear and that are relevant to the choices that they actually are able to make. But then our workshops have also included some of those, division executives, division of wildlife executives for a state agency. So they're able to kind of offer some institutional perspective about what's in bounds and what's out of bounds, and can we write something in a way that is more palatable to broadly like an agency to be able to pick this up and use it.
Thanks, Stefan. We have a few more questions, try to go through them quickly. Also appreciate Code Abelson sharing a resource on wildlife crossing. It's a question from Ali Scott, really asking, that so much work focuses on restoration of past and recent conditions, but adaptation requires planning for future and novel conditions. So any thought on how we start to change these perspectives in conservation? I think you touched on that earlier.
Sorry, could you repeat that? It kind of cut out a little bit.
Yeah, it's really about how do we start to change perspectives around transformation, transition type approaches in conservation.
Yeah, I don't know. What do you think, Stephen?
I'm hogging the mic too much here. Yeah, so we have seen many instances where we'll get managers into a workshop environment where it's very clear that business as usual, their starting point is restoration, and that and we've seen those kind of light bulb moments. Sometimes it is that step 3 in our adaptation workbook that I mentioned, where we actually give people time to consider, are my management goals and objectives still feasible, or are they increasingly challenging because of climate change? And sometimes managers just need that opportunity to reflect and to be able to provide a rationale. Like, I feel like in some cases managers don't feel like they are empowered to express their wish to do something different. And so in some cases, the workbook process has kind of segmented that in a way that opens up their ability to do that. And also seeing the menu and seeing the full spectrum of ideas from resisting change and playing defense all the way to transition, we have also seen that kind of stimulate some new creativity. But it's certainly like not everyone is jumping to that end of the pool all at once.
But we're definitely seeing a transition in our experience as well for the last several years, that the conversation around transformation, transition, directing is just much more openly done without much pushback. Next question from Moss is, are there any wildlife management strategies that get left out of the menu due to the focus mostly on climate change? And do you think encompassing other threats like diseases, land use conversion, invasion are less emphasized?
I mean, I'll take it from the literature review component. I mean, no doubt. Like, there's definitely stressors that require specific adaptation that are not necessarily, captured when we're looking for climate change adaptation. There's just no doubt about it. I mean, I think in some respects, we do, some of those kind of come up naturally in conversations a little bit, especially with workshops, when we think about like synergistic effects with, land use change, when we think about disease. But I think, with most of these menus, we really are trying to focus on climate change adaptation. So I would say that there's absolutely certain strategies that are kind of left on the cutting room floor in some respects as we go through this process, and that's just kind of how it happens. But I do think that we at some point kind of revisit it one way or another when we think especially about interactions with other important stressors.
Yeah, and I'd be interested to hear your take on that after you have had a moment to look through the strategies and approaches and to see like, oh, well, how much of this is just kind of generally applicable, or how much of it is too specific in that climate change domain. I was at actually Ben and I both, I think, were at the Wildlife Society conference a couple of years ago, and someone came up to me after a presentation on this and said, hey, I want to bring this to my wildlife disease working group, and we should just talk about this, all of these ideas as wildlife disease strategies. And I don't know enough even to begin to know whether there's some truth to that.
Yeah, thanks for that, Stephen. Give it back to Win to do some work. One last question. Let's take this last question from Joel Smith, and maybe get a quick answer on this. So in monitoring and evaluation, are metrics and indicators being applied? If so, are you seeing common ones being applied that vary across projects? A tough one, I guess.
Ben, I know you got to go. Do you want to say anything?
Yeah, I was thinking about it. I mean, certainly, they definitely are being applied. I'm trying to think of whether or not we definitely talk about strategies that kind of talk about realignment of monitoring, like, for example, if we're getting new species in new areas or shifting phenologies, and sort of thinking about, are there certain monitoring frameworks that need to be shifted or adapted or modified under these sort of new and novel conditions? So that's definitely something that I know has come up.
Right. Well, we just ran out of time for our formal session. I just want to thank our speakers again. Please, you can use your the reaction button and thank them. Thank you both. That's absolutely fantastic. And so I'll stop the recording at this point and we'll move into our informal session.